what I call the gambler's fallacy. If I can just roll one more time, I know I've won before, I can win again. I know this will work. And we are also watching as large numbers of aircraft are being sent back to the theater. And I think before long, we're going to find out that every B 52, every B 1, every B 2 is going to be loaded up with everything they can carry. And we are going to go after Iran with a vengeance in the belief that this time we'll get it right. Now, what most people don't understand is we've already done this for all intents and purposes. I listened to Mike Pence, the former vice president, say, well, we just need to take the gloves off of the armed forces. He doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. We've already done as much as we can do. But there is this belief, I think, in Trump's head that we can do more. And this time around, we'll get it right. The regime or the government, which I prefer to use, of Iran will collapse. The society will disintegrate. I don't agree with that, but I think that's where we are.
America has spent decades building a military designed to project power almost anywhere on Earth. But the Iran conflict is forcing Washington to confront a question that is much harder than simply asking who has the bigger arsenal. What happens when overwhelming military power can no longer produce an overwhelming political result? Colonel Douglas Macgregor argues that the problem goes deeper than one campaign. In his view, the United States entered the conflict believing that air power, precision weapons, and economic pressure could force Iran to bend. But Iran has survived the pressure, and the consequences are now spreading beyond the battlefield. Oil markets are under strain. The Strait of Hormuz has become a central strategic pressure point. Gulf states are calculating their own risks. And Washington is facing a larger question about how much power it can realistically project at once. So how did the world's most powerful military reach this point? And what happens if the next escalation doesn't solve the problem? That's where the story begins.
Nothing's changed. And it didn't really matter what we did in most cases when you were dealing with these smaller states where we chose to intervene. We were overwhelmingly powerful. There wasn't a great deal they could do about it. And I think they misjudged Iran. They thought they were dealing with another Iraq or Syria or Saudi Arabia or Libya, and they weren't. And they've gotten an education the hard way. And now, instead of recognizing the limits of our power and the prudent action that should be taken, which is to disengage and get out of this mess, I'm afraid we're doubling down on failure.
That is the first distinction we need to make. Macgregor is making an interpretation about American strategy, but the underlying question is measurable. Can military force actually achieve the political objective Washington wants? A country does not have to defeat the United States conventionally to make a campaign strategically expensive. It only has to survive, continue producing weapons, keep enough military capability to threaten critical infrastructure, and make escalation increasingly costly. And that is where Iran becomes different from many of the conflicts Washington has fought since the Cold War. The United States may have enormous advantages in aircraft, intelligence, logistics, and long-range strike capability. But those advantages do not automatically translate into political control over a large country. And now the conflict is moving towards something far more consequential. Because the next problem isn't just whether Iran can absorb another strike. It's whether the United States can absorb the economic and strategic consequences of continuing the fight.
Unfortunately, I think they do now. Let me caveat that, or offer this caveat. They are aware that we are a large and powerful, historically hegemonic power since the end of the Second World War that is in decline. I think they recognize that. We were always struggling for dominance with the Soviet Union, but when the Soviet Union collapsed, we were the last man standing. Our allies had largely disarmed themselves, as you know, and so we were the only ones out there with any significant military power. And I think they became sort of inebriated with power. The results of Desert Storm led them to the conclusion there was no one else out there that could stand against us, and that this was a relatively permanent condition. So we didn't do our jobs, we didn't do our homework. Nietzsche once said that war makes the victor stupid.
Hmm.
In other words, winning and winning decisively is almost worse than losing because you learn nothing and you conclude that you're something you are not. And that's what we did when we embarked on this war with Iran. And I got into a polite disagreement with a friend the other day who was trying to say, well, that General Kane, he tried to talk to the president about the limits of air power and all this sort of thing. I said, wait a minute. Anyone with any sense at all, any professional depth would have said, this is the dumbest idea possible. Mr. President, don't do this. This will wreck your presidency. We will waste time, money, and resources on a campaign we don't need to fight that we can't win, at least not exclusively with air and missile power. But he was an airman, remember? And every airman privately believes that they can ultimately replace everyone in the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. That all they need are airplanes and missiles, and they can do it all. So he wasn't about to say, no, I don't think we should do this. He may have said, we're going to have to, it's going to be tough, but we'll supply the target sets and see how this goes.
There's an important distinction here between what Macgregor believes happened and what we can independently establish. His larger argument is that American military superiority created a strategic habit. If a problem could not be solved politically, Washington could escalate militarily. But today's Middle East is not operating in isolation. As of August 11th, Iran was still threatening to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed unless Washington changed its behavior and met Iranian conditions. Reuters reported that the demands included ending the war and unfreezing Iranian assets. That matters because Hormuz is not just another stretch of water. It is a critical energy choke point. The U.S. Energy Information Administration has estimated U.S. strategic oil inventories at roughly 413 million barrels through the first quarter of 2026. And the broader energy picture is already deteriorating. Reuters reported on August 11th that disruptions had shut in roughly 5.5 million barrels per day of Middle Eastern oil production during July, more than 5% of global consumption, while EIA forecasts projected some regional production could remain offline through 2027. So the stakes are no longer limited to whether a strike succeeds. The real question is what happens when military escalation begins feeding directly into energy security, shipping, inflation, and the strategic position of America's Gulf partners. And that is where Macgregor's final argument becomes much bigger than Iran.
And that's interesting because I would think he would welcome that because they then become targets in Israel. And that promises to bind us ever more closely to Israel and his destiny. So I'm a little surprised at that. The answer is, of course, yes. Look, what has happened is very simple. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, all of these places, Saudi Arabia, they've all come to the same conclusion. We cannot protect them. And if your hegemonic military power proves unequal to the task of protecting them, then it's time for the hegemonic military power to get the hell out. And I think what they're going to do is tell us to go. And indeed, we should. Because the longer we remain, the more often they become targets. And remember, Iran has made it crystal clear that if we resume the attacks on them and do the things that President Trump has threatened he will do with the weapons at hand, that they will annihilate, destroy, remove, whatever you want to use for a word, the remaining oil infrastructure in the Gulf region and Saudi Arabia. You have the Houthis that are now making life very, very interesting in the Red Sea for the Saudis. I see no end in sight for that. So the point is that things will not go back to normal whenever this ends. In fact, things will be much bleaker. The world will have to adapt to a very different world. And by the way, once it's made clear to us that we've got to get out, there's only one power on the planet left that can actually finance the restoration or rebuilding of all that infrastructure. China.
And that brings us to the real issue. This isn't simply about whether Iran can defeat the United States. The bigger question is whether Washington can achieve its objectives at a cost it can sustain. Macgregor argues that America entered the conflict with outdated assumptions about military power. Some of his claims remain unverified, but the strategic pressure is real. Reuters reported on August 11th that Iran was still demanding conditions for reopening the Strait of Hormuz, while EIA projections indicated some Middle Eastern oil production could remain offline through 2027. If the conflict continues, the impact could reach far beyond the battlefield, affecting oil prices, shipping, supply chains, military resources, and America's relationships with Gulf allies. That doesn't prove American global leadership is ending or that China will replace the United States. But it does raise a serious question. Can military power still deliver the political outcome Washington wants? A superpower can win battles and still lose strategic leverage if it cannot turn military strength into a lasting political outcome. So what happens next? Does Washington keep escalating, or does it look for a way out? Subscribe for more geopolitical analysis that separates verified facts from claims and predictions.